Vince McMahon dropped by the Pat McAfee Show in studio for a live interview on Thursday. They claimed it was the first time in 15 years that Vince had sat down for a live interview like this, completely ignoring the live interview he did with Steve Austin in 2014. And the questions that Austin asked were a lot tougher than anything we got in this interview. I didn't expect Pat McAfee to be Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes or anything like that, but the interview was pretty much exactly what I expected it to be. There was a lot of fluff, but also some interesting insights into Vince McMahon, the businessman, and Vince McMahon, the person. Now, I get that McAfee was ecstatic to have Vince in the studio. It was a big get for him, but I would say more than half the interview felt like Pat thanking him for coming on, to the point where Vince looked uncomfortable with it, but then again, he also doesn't like it when people thank him anyway. He doesn't even want people thanking him in their Hall of Fame speeches. But Vince got there over 20 minutes late, but he stayed for over an hour. He even stayed late to take a few extra questions from Pat's crew at the end, which I thought was cool. They also broke some news. The biggest surprise, though, I would say to me, was that they did not shoot any kind of an angle for McAfee's match at WrestleMania. Vince did offer him the chance to have a WrestleMania match. The rumors were that it was going to be Vince McMahon against Pat McAfee, and come on. The guy is 76 years old, hasn't had a match in a decade. He was not wrestling Pat McAfee. I figured it would be somebody wrestling on his behalf, like Austin Theory, and we learned on SmackDown that's exactly what it was. That's exactly what they're doing, McAfee against Theory, and I think that could be a really entertaining match. But there was no angle on this show at all to set it up. It was just, hey, Pat, you want to have a WrestleMania match? And Pat was like, holy shit, yeah, absolutely. He goes, we'll find an opponent for you, pal. And McAfee was joking, how about that Undertaker guy? And Vince was laughing, it's not going to be him. But that was it. So no real angle shot on this show. But McMahon did announce that he himself would be personally inducting The Undertaker into the Hall of Fame this year. And I get it. They've worked together for so long, and Vince is the one who created the Undertaker persona and brought it to him and brought it to life. Undertaker brought it to life, but they go back a long way, and Undertaker has said that Vince is like a father figure to him. He would take a bullet for the man. I just don't think that Vince McMahon with that voice should be giving any kind of long speeches these days. But it says something about how he feels about Mark Calloway, the person, that he would want to do the speech to induct him, given that very rarely does he even appear at the Hall of Fame, let alone give any induction speeches. He has personally inducted 3 other people into the Hall of Fame. Undertaker will be number 4. The first person that Vince McMahon inducted into the Hall of Fame, I think it was back in 94, was James Dudley, who worked for Vince's father and his grandfather. He inducted Donald Trump into the Hall of Fame, and he inducted Stone Cold Steve Austin into the... And that made a ton of sense. Austin versus McMahon. This company shot into the stratosphere on the backbone of that angle. And now you can add Undertaker to that list. Pat put over his success with the WWE Network and how everybody doubted him when he first did it. And here we are now, all these years later, and everybody has a subscription service, and so you were a pioneer in that. And Pat said he doesn't think that anybody could have done what you did, and there's a lot of this during the interview. Vince said that he likes to avoid a lot of pats on the back, but he also avoids negatives. He avoids negative comments. Yes, we can tell. Pat asked him why he doesn't like the word wrestling. Vince said it's all about branding yourself differently than everybody else, and when you say it out loud, he said he would much rather be a WWE superstar than a professional wrestler. And Pat brought up how the Panda got them, which is why they had to change from the WWF to WWE, and Vince claimed he didn't even know what the World Wildlife Fund was, which, depending on how far back he's referring to, is probably a lie. Maybe in the early 80s he legitimately had no idea what they were, but If he's implying that until they got sued or whatever, that he didn't know who they were, that's just a fucking lie. I mean, they even had an agreement with the Panda people in 1994 about how they could and could not use the WWF initials. And the only reason that it even ended up going to court years later is because that they just completely ignored the agreement that they made. They kept going back on their word, and finally the Panda people were like, fuck this. And then they tried to extort WWE out of millions of dollars. But Pat did briefly mention AEW. It was a fleeting mention of AEW purchasing Ring of Honor, which I thought was an appropriate thing to ask. I don't think that he needed to go into like questions about it. What do you think of AEW? What do you think of Tony Khan? What do you think about New Japan? Like, it didn't have to be that kind of interview, but it was definitely newsworthy. I mean, literally less than 24 hours before this interview, Tony Khan went on television and announced that he bought Ring of Honor. You know, a company that WWE had their own discussions apparently in trying to buy. And AEW got it instead. So I thought it would have been kind of interesting to at least ask him, you know, if he had any thoughts on that. But, he probably would have given a non-response, but you at least try asking the question because you could tie it into current events. Oh, this news just broke yesterday. What do you think about this? And he didn't follow up with any of that at all. He just kind of briefly mentioned it and moved on. And instead, he asked him a general question about whether or not he enjoys competition. What do you think? How many times have we heard Vince McMahon say over the years that he enjoys competition? He likes a good fight. And so this is what I mean. You get a lot of these softball type questions, you know, in the interview. So, of course, Vince said yes, he does. He said he learned as a kid when he made it through the beatings that he would get. He realized once the beatings were over, oh, I survived. And so later in life, there was really nothing anybody could do to him that would really bother him. So that took a bit of a dark turn. He did tell Pat about his upbringing, coming from a trailer park with no running water. You know, it is quite the success story that he has had in his life to go from, quite literally, the outhouse to the penthouse. And Netflix is even working on a multi-part documentary about the life of Vince McMahon right now. They're working on it. It's supposed to be released sometime this year. I mean, unless it gets pushed back due to COVID or something, you know, if there were delays, I don't know. But it is supposed to be coming out this year. That would have been the perfect spot for Pat to ask him about that. Because, you know, his background and his upbringing is an interesting story. And I'm sure it'll be reflected in the documentary, but how much of it, you know, we don't know. I think that would have been the perfect spot for Pat to say, hey, you know, Netflix is working on this documentary. WWE is working on it, you know, in tandem with Netflix. How's that going? Or have you seen any of the early cuts? How much of your early life is covered in it? You know, once Vince brought the subject up, I wish you would have asked him about it. But it's possible Pat doesn't even know about it. I did laugh when Pat asked him if he had seen any of Young Rock on NBC. And have you seen Young Rock and the person who plays you on the show? And he was like, no. He wasn't even aware of it. I don't get the sense Vince McMahon sits around watching television very much. He produces a lot of television, but I don't get the sense he sits around watching too much television. Although one of the funniest thing all week, Brock Lesnar was making the rounds. He was doing some media heading into the Madison Square Garden show last night. And he was on with, I think he was on with Michael Kay. I think he was on with Michael Kay, who is the voice of the Yankees, and he's a big sports radio voice here in New York. And they were getting into a discussion, I think, about whether or not he watches television. And I think Peter Rosenberg brought up Seinfeld. And Brock said, yeah, I've seen Seinfeld. And then he goes... He goes, yeah, I've seen the Friends. You know, I've seen the Friends. And they asked him, who's your favorite character on Friends? He goes, probably Monica. But just the way he said it, like, yeah, I've seen the Friends. I immediately thought of Bret Hart. Just put the word "the" in front of the beginning of everything. The WCW. The SummerSlam. Brock Lesnar watches the Friends. Fucking love it. I don't think Vince McMahon watches the Friends. But he said taking the company public in 1999 helped make him a better businessman. And before that, he would make decisions with his heart instead of his head. And in reference to all of the talent releases, he said that these decisions can be tough because you know the person and maybe they have kids or maybe they have somebody in the family that is battling cancer. All of that computes in your head. But once you're a public company, that helps him make better business decisions. And so I guess all of that other stuff no longer matters. And that may be the biggest takeaway from this interview. It's true that a publicly traded company, if you have what's called a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders to make the decisions that are going to be best for the business. But the only audience that Vince McMahon really answers to, it's not us. It's not you, and when I say you and me, I don't mean like the so-called smart fans or internet fans. I mean, I hate even using that. It's such a fucking dumb term. What does that even mean, these days, internet fans? But I'm talking the fans in general. He doesn't answer to us. He answers to his shareholders. That's the only audience that truly matters to him. So no matter what flaws there may be in the product, and there are many, so long as they're able to sign those big deals with Comcast and with Fox and with the Saudi government, and they're improving their bottom line and they're making more, and they are making more money than ever before, that keeps Wall Street happy, and that's all that really matters to them. There isn't that direct accountability to the audience that they used to have when they were a private company. That's probably the biggest thing that's missing from WWE these days as compared to how it used to be. They used to answer to us because they had no choice. And now they don't really answer to us. We don't matter as much as the shareholders and the people on Wall Street. So creatively speaking, they don't have to be at their creative best. I mean, they could just put the bare minimum effort in as far as that goes. But as long as they're still making money and have all these different deals and merchandising deals and licensing and sell the network to Peacock and all that kind of stuff, then that's all they care about. So when he claimed in the interview that, I'm concerned about what's best for the audience, he's full of shit. That is the biggest crock of shit that I have ever heard. He also used the words dead weight to describe cutting talent to make way for new talent. I mean, considering all the names they cut last year alone, that's an awful lot of dead weight to be carrying around, I guess. He said sometimes when people aren't given an opportunity, or they are, and it doesn't work out, they rarely look in the mirror and say, I was the guy who fucked up. It was on me. Instead, they have a million excuses why things didn't work, and generally, he says, I'm the bad guy, the old blame game. That's part of the job. Yeah, sometimes that does happen. People like to blame anybody but themselves, but again, it rings hollow when you look at all of the talent that they have parted ways with in the last year, and a lot of those people, they're going to be just fine. A lot of them have already landed in AEW and other places. But to say they don't look in the mirror and take responsibility for their own failings and they just blame me, yeah, sometimes they do blame you, and for good reason. It's not an all or nothing thing, but yeah, sometimes it is your fault. You're the puppet master. You pull the strings. He told the story that Jim Ross shared with him about JR being in the bathroom stall one day when a bunch of old school promoters walked in and they started talking about having Vince killed without realizing, this is when Vince was first, he was going national and he was starting to put people out of business is what he was doing. And the territories were starting to feel the pinch. And so they were trying to conspire to kill Vince McMahon. And they didn't know that Jim Ross was taking a shit in one of the stalls. And Jim realized what was going on. And Vince is describing him as he's pulling his legs up so nobody sees the legs underneath the stall door. They didn't know he was in there. And Vince said that JR didn't tell him that story until 5 years after Jim Ross started working for him. Which is kind of funny that he didn't give Vince a heads up. Yeah, they talked about, Pat was asking him, how do you hit the gym or whatever? And he says, he starts training around 1:30 in the morning and finishes at 3 o'clock. He goes, he overtrains a lot, but it's his only outlet. He does it for his mind more than his body. And they talked about Wrestlemania. Of course, the branding for this year's Wrestlemania, it's the most stupendous two-night Wrestlemania. They always have to have their buzzwords. And, Vince explained that. He says, look, the word stupendous isn't used very much. People have to go to a dictionary to look up what it means. So whoever it was who brought this up in some meeting, I guess they were having one day in the back or in the office, he said, that's an interesting word. It's not in our everyday speak. So you use a word like that to try to get people's attention. Pat brought up the HBO show Succession and how there are comparisons to what is going on in WWE. And he goes, are there worries that, WWE might not be yours at some point? And he said that he doesn't really think about that a lot. He hopes the company is going to continue, whether it's with a family member or not. He goes, you have to be objective and look at family members like employees, other employees. He says he expects, if anything, he expects more out of his family. He says he has to do the right thing for business, and if it isn't working out, then you have to deal with it. I just thought, LOL Shane. Hey, he's not lying. He's not lying. He sent his own son home. McAfee said that, he heard a lot of things about Vince when he first started the job on SmackDown. Vince is going to be in your ear all the time, and he looks at it as he looks forward to having a billionaire brain in his ear every week. And he says, honestly, for the most part, Vince pretty much just lets him do his thing. And Vince said, look, if I didn't like what you were doing, then you wouldn't be doing it. So his experience has been a positive one so far. And I think McAfee has brought a lot of life to the commentary booth. He and Michael Cole have turned into a great team on SmackDown. If anything, he has helped Cole elevate his game. I said that not long after McAfee started. You heard and saw a change in Michael Cole when he started working with Pat McAfee. Jerry Lawler is another one who I think over the years has said, for all the years that he did commentary, Vince McMahon knew enough, I think, to pretty much leave him alone. He wasn't yelling in his ear, he was yelling in Jim Ross's ear. But Lawler's another one. He did color commentary, and I'm not saying Vince isn't in his ear, but it was never really an issue. But Mick Foley flat out quit. When they put Mick Foley in the booth on SmackDown with Jim Ross, after the draft, I think it was, they started working together in 2008, although Foley was already doing some commentary by that point. But then they drafted JR over to SmackDown. I think it was going to be JR and Foley. Foley didn't last very long in that role. He couldn't take it anymore. The verbal abuse that he was getting in his ears. So everyone's experience is different. There have been a lot of horror stories about that, but Pat obviously hasn't had to really deal with that so far. And I think also Vince probably realizes that he can't, he's not going to treat Pat McAfee the same way that he probably treated fucking Mick Foley and start cussing him out and yelling in his ear on commentary, because he knows damn well Pat McAfee can go fuck you and get up and go home and he'll be just fine, because he's getting paid, tens of millions of dollars now to do his show. He's got the biggest show on all of YouTube. WWE likes to treat their celebrities well. It's their own people that they sometimes treat like shit, not the celebrities that they bring in. So I'm not surprised that Pat McAfee is very, Vince McMahon is very hands-off as far as Pat McAfee goes on commentary. They talked very briefly about the Attitude Era. McAfee was raving about it and how fun it was, and Vince said it was like the Wild West, and they had a blast. And he shared a story about the bedpan segment, the Dr. Austin segment, and he could, as Vince was working out the logistics of shooting and what they were going to do next, he saw Austin with a bedpan in his hand. He was kind of lightly tapping it against his own head, trying to figure out, hey, this can make a good sound. We can use this. So I like hearing little stories like that. Of course, that's one of the all-time great segments in Raw history. It did make a great sound. They talked about Michael Cole. McAfee brought up Cole. He was bringing him up to praise him, and then Vince McMahon cut him off and said, horrible human being. And they all busted out laughing. Vince talked about not liking school when he was younger and not being very good at it. He never really learned how to study. He had to go to summer school to get into college. It took him 5 years to get through college, which I kind of feel like is the standard these days. A lot of people I know, it took them 5 or 6 years to get through college. Not because they were stupid or anything, but just to get the number of credits they needed. That was almost me. I had to cram, 21 credits, I think, in my final term just to make sure I, got out of there on time. Because there was one course I bowed out of. It was like I ended up in an astronomy class, I think in my junior year or something like that. And it took me all of, a week and a half maybe to realize, this shit ain't for me. And so I pulled out, and then I realized afterwards, I said, shit, I'm going to be, 3 or 4 credits short. So I had to double up on stuff in my final term. So I don't know. I feel like 5 years of college sounds like a pretty normal thing these days for a lot of people. But he graduated with a degree in business administration. And, try to get through college and get out of there. He went to a few professors and wanted to talk to them about upping the grades that they gave him, or else he wouldn't be able to graduate. And one of them was willing to change his grade. The other one wasn't. He actually went to that professor's house, and the professor threatened to call the cops on him. And Vince was like, well, call the cops. I've got nothing to lose. I'm going to fail anyway. That was his attitude. Pat referred to him as the greatest heel of all time, and how some people say he's the great. I agree. I've said it on the podcast before. Vince McMahon is the greatest wrestling heel. Yeah, Mr. McMahon is the greatest wrestling heel of all time. I absolutely agree. He says that the difficulty is that as much fun as it was to perform, the difficulty is that when you're doing that, you cannot produce or direct. And I've heard that story as well, that Vince, wanted to take himself off television. This was years ago, and do less and less on camera because it took him away from being in the gorilla position and being on headset and directing traffic. And that's really where he goes, that's where the action is. And that's where he wants to be. They talked a little bit about what injuries have you suffered. He brought up the time that he severed both of his quads. He goes, the problem with that is that you can't walk or stand. You can't do anything. I am still shocked by how quickly he recovered from what we were told were 2 torn quads. I remember Triple H, the first time he tore his quad, he was gone for like 8 months. The second time he was gone for about 6 or 7 months. Vince tore both quads, and he was a lot older than Triple H was when he tore his. He tore both quads in January at the Royal Rumble. And I remember reading at the time, that I think it was like by WrestleMania time or something, I think he was already back on his feet. I know he was back to work earlier than that. I think he might have been in a wheelchair, but I don't know. The stories were like he was back in like 2 or 3 months, something insane like that. It never made any sense to me. So either people were just completely bullshitting and he wasn't back, or maybe he didn't fully tear both quads. I don't know, but that just sounds insane to me. That he would be able to make it. Now, granted, he wasn't wrestling, but like he said, you have a lot of rehab you have to do. You can't even really stand or walk on your own. You got to relearn how to walk, and it sounds like he was back at work doing his thing within a matter of a couple of months after that happened. It's pretty crazy. So look, we don't get to see Vince McMahon in a live setting like this very often, so the novelty of it made this feel like an event, made this feel like a big deal. But if you were expecting any new ground to be broken here, you didn't find any of that. Vince was right about one thing, though, when he said, I'm just wired differently. He goes, my brain works differently than the average human being. He's definitely wired differently. That is for sure.